Hi, welcome to Write More Light. My name is Sarah with the Midwest Writing Center. Write More Light is our web series in which once a week we talk about something in writing, do some kind of short lesson, and once a week I interview someone doing really awesome things in the arts. Today we have with us, me talking really slowly to stall, Dr. Tamar Boyadjian. She is an internationally recognized and award-winning author, Western Armenian poet, editor, translator, and medievalist. She's written and published widely on the subjects of medieval Armenian literature, the ethics of endangered language translation, which you may recognize her from our conversation about endangered language, and preservation, Armenian futurism, and the place of Western Armenian and the role of women writers in Western Armenian literary history. She's currently editor-in-chief of the Journal of the Society for Armenian Studies. Her most recent book, A Drop of Woman, Unnamed, Unwritten, will be released in 2024, and I am dying to see it in English when the time comes. She is currently authoring a fantasy series in Western Armenian for young adults to be published by RP Publishing. The title of book one is The Mape and the Dragon. Did I pronounce RP or the title correctly?
Yeah, the Mepe and the
Mepe.
Dragon. Yeah.
And the Dragon. So cool. Thank you so much for hanging out with me again. I know we have several topics. I know you are an expert in several topics that I get really excited about. So hopefully we can just have a Dr. Boyadjian series.
Thank you. I love being here. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for having me again.
So I want to start real slow. I like to treat these like 101 classes, or like tell me like I'm five. How would you define fantasy, the genre in literature?
Oh, that's not a 101 class.
I mean, I'm walking in and I'm like, do I want to go into the fantasy section of the bookstore? What's over there? Tell me like I'm five.
Oh, wow. Fantasy is a very complicated, but almost simplified, I think, category or genre. And in as the name suggests, it is probably a genre of writing that not fantasy like otherworldly, one of not our own world, an imagined space. I would like to get into how the genre of fantasy has evolved over time. But I guess I would say that its ancestors are like epic literature, medieval romance, and primarily I guess the genre flourished in 19th century, European, I would say imperial times or times of colonialism, which I'm happy to talk more about. And now today fantasy, I would say, is can be very much synonymous with an imaginary or a futurism for many cultures that are, or many people who are authoring fantasy that are not white, basically. And what I mean by that specifically is when we think about futurism or futurisms, or what we call imagined communities, we think about exploring a world where that community can both acknowledge the trauma of its past, but also imagine a future where that trauma is not handicapping their experience as a culture or a people or their language. And so fantasy or imaginary or Afrofuturisms like Afrofuturism, Armenian future, so on, allow people to inhabit spaces textually, virtually, even auditory spaces that create healed and healthy communities of those people and their interactions with other communities.
I'm so excited that you brought futurism into it because, I mean, obviously there's a connection, and I didn't have it on my mind to talk about today. I do. Ugh, I'm. That's another area I would love to just dive so hard into. So I think that was a beautiful combination of 101 and tell me like I'm five. Thank you. I hadn't thought about how myths figure into written language, written stories. Because of course, the epics and the oral storytelling were all about things outside reality, if you want to phrase it that way.
Yeah.
I chose those words, you didn't. I just want to not put that on you. And that never occurred to me either. Fantasy is, this is a disclaimer, uh, a genre that I am new to. I loved it a lot when I was reading like middle grade. And then for whatever reason, I just stopped. Most recently, and I may have said this to you before, I've certainly said it on the web series before. My goals my reading goals always consist of reading local and reading outside my comfort zone. And so recently, and I guess it's probably been 2 years now, I managed to do a combo and read an Iowa City author's book, The Purple Door District, and that's urban fantasy. And I was like, okay, I can kind of like, I can see this hybrid here where it's taking things that are familiar to me and sort of easing me into this world, which I thought was pretty cool because I'm the person who needs it, who needs the like hand holding into the genre. Um, I said all of that just as a disclaimer that like a lot of my questions are going to be really naive or really ignorant because it is something that I have no familiarity with. So, knowing what we've read from your bio, we know that your work is deeply engaged with culture. So how does working with fantasy first, um, how does your commitment to cultural preservation work with your work, or inform your work in fantasy writing?
Thanks for that question. So before I could even talk about my book, I have to talk about the opportunity that arose to even be able to write such a book. So I'm going to do a huge plug here for RP Krikorian Jimbashian and RP Publishing, a publishing house for young adults that was started in Los Angeles by RP Jimbashian Krikorian, who I frequently refer to as my guardian angel. And RP is one of the most beautiful, dedicated souls I have ever met to cultural preservation, particularly with Western Armenian. And so, with her efforts, she single handedly, and now, of course, there's others involved, but initiated this publishing house in LA to publish books for young adults, particularly for, middle school, high school, the grades and the ages that don't see Armenian literature in a contemporary way. And usually, I mean, having gone to Armenian school myself, are like really reading things that might seem for their generation or our generation important, but somewhat outdated. And so I really just want to give a shout out to her and to the publishing house, because I have wanted to write fantasy for so long, but the possibility of that was really not realistic, in the sense that how would I have gotten an audience for my readership, having writing in Western Armenian. And so RP Publishing has been hugely supportive of this endeavor. I am so grateful for them. And so basically this adventure started about a year ago, when I proposed a fantasy series to RP Publishing, and they accepted basically my proposal. And so I began writing what I would say, has been a decade-long project, actually. Yeah. um, Sarah, I forgot your question.
Uh, I mean, you didn't not answer it.
Right, I
How
feel
does
like
your work in
there was
how
more I
does your
wanted
work
to say.
in
More I wanted
or
to
how does
say.
your commitment to engaging with and preserving culture inform your fantasy work? And I think that you gave us how you started down this path.
Yeah. And so, in terms of cultural preservation, obviously the series is being written intentionally in Western Armenian. And what has become the most fascinating journey in language itself, because there is no, I guess I have no example of such a genre in Western Armenian. So here I am trying to actually create the genre of fantasy in Western Armenian. And when I started writing, or I had this kind of story in my mind, but when I started world building, and I wanted to not really rely on European fantasy as my model, I really wanted to use, like the Swana area and like Arabic, Persian, Armenian literature, as kind of my precursor for thinking about world building. I said, okay, where do I turn? Right? Like, and I said, oh, okay, well, I guess I'm going to turn to ancient and medieval Armenian historiography. But I'm not going to read it now as an academic, or I'm not going to read it as someone that's looking at it as a literary study, but I'm going to read it as mythical. I'm going to read it as how could I read these texts as fantasy? So I went back to like the basics. I went to the historiographies of the 5th, 8th, 9th, 10th century, Khorenatsi, Lazar Parbetsi, Pavestos Puzant. And I started rereading these things, thinking about, well, how would I imagine writing fantasy using these texts as kind of like, my basics, like the things that I would fall upon. And of course, I had read these things before, but this time I noticed dragons and different kinds of allusions to mythicism, or different kinds of allusions to the mythical, to the fairy tale, to all these things that really like made me so excited to rethink the genre of fantasy, not as something unique of its own today, but as an extension of mythology and potential mythology of Armenians, and obviously the people that they interacted, Greeks, Persians, and so on, throughout their history, that of course made its way into Armenian literary history. So it's a really exciting but challenging task, because one, I find myself thinking about, I write with pictures actually. And most of this book is about me imagining the story in my head and then figuring out how to translate that image into Western Armenian. And so there, of course, will be, I think both the beauty and the problematic nature of language is that, everything about language is in essence a translation. So of course, I'm translating the pictures I see in my head, and then whoever reads the language will translate that into a different picture in their head. But the words I have found are something I have to be super creative with, because whereas, for example, in English, you could say something like the word adventure, there's maybe 4 or 5 words in Armenian that aren't exactly that word, but then you would have to rethink, well, what kind of adventure is it, right? So you have to basically then within language nuance that. And oftentimes I find myself rather explaining more than relying on a single word. So all this has been a really fun and interesting and challenging adventure to think about what kind of words do we rely on when we're writing Western Armenian fantasy. And how does that shift the way we think about the genre? So as you're writing fantasy, that most of the time, people imagine is a Western European kind of genre, right? Which of course we've been moving away from in the last decade or so. But how do you not rely on that as your anchor? And how do you rebuild an anchor that's based on something else? I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what the something else is yet, right? But I know what I don't want it to be, in essence.
So I understand that you, and I could be wrong, especially with this project, you write in Armenian first, yeah?
Yes.
Um, I had a couple of questions and I didn't write down the tangent my brain went on, so we'll probably get back to that. So when you have something like the word adventure, which I feel like it describes a lot of what's going on in fantasy, and you end up doing the explaining that you said, like you have to, if you don't have the one word that does it all, and this is going to be true of all translation, there are plenty of words that don't exist in English that could be very easily explained in other languages. Does that get in the way of your art or of your story sometimes?
No, I think it enhances it, because I think that it forces you to think about the core meaning of a word and the appropriate nature of the word. But also, I think it forces the imagination of the word itself. Because, for example, if I was writing in English and I relied on the word adventure, which is, like you said, probably the core thing that that moves fantasy, right? There is an adventure. There's a large, they say like every story has two stories, right? The larger story, the larger adventure, and then the mini adventures that all, end up tying together into this greater adventure. But I think not having that word come so easily forces you to really think about what you're describing. It forces you to really think about what action it is that's driving the story. And almost in my, I felt like it makes you less lazy in language itself, right? Because now you don't have a whole list of created vocabulary that could, very easily fit into the story. You're actually creating vocabulary in order to describe your story.
That's really interesting, and I'm really grateful that that was your answer. I wasn't gonna like judge you or anything if it was not your answer,
Yeah.
but it hadn't occurred to me because I was stuck on the difficulty. But you're saying, um, you're having said that it helps you understand your own intentions and understand language probably more deeply. That's just so heartening.
Thank you. Like I'll give you an example specifically with Armenian that I'm challenging in the book. So Armenian is a non-gendered language. So what we mean by that is that some languages assign grammatical gender. This is just grammatical gender to nouns and so on. And some languages do not have grammatical gender. So Armenian is a language that does not assign grammatical gender. So for example, if you learn Latin, you'd have to learn if a particular word is feminine, masculine, or neutral. But there was a movement, or there's some words in Armenian that have a feminized suffix. So, for example, the word king will have a word equivalent to queen that has this feminized suffix uhi. So I'm really not a big fan of what I call the uhi words. The word attempt to feminize a particular word that is gender neutral in its etymology, but has become over time assigned kind of or overtaken by a male gender, or assumed male gender. And then to create an equivalent of that word, then we have this uhi or other feminized endings. So then we have the proper quote unquote words for queen and king, takavor, takuhi. Or for example, an author or writer, kraked, a person who is a writer in its etymology, gender neutral. And then we have this krakeduhi, oh, a woman writer, which I'm totally against that adjective, right? So I bring this up because I was very much resistant on how to use the word of an ultimate ruler or a ruler in Armenian. I don't like the word takavod because now it's come to mean an inherently male gendered ruler, right? I'm resisting the word takuhi because now it has that uhi, suffix that attempts to feminize almost ontologically the word king by providing its equivalent of queen. So here comes the word mepe. And so mepe, it means ruler, and it's a borrowing actually from the Georgian language. And it's a gender, basically. So my name, Tamar, comes from a queen or a mepe, a ruler in Georgian history, who actually today Georgians refer to as King Tamar of Georgia, because the word queen in Georgian just meant a queen consort. And so because the royal bloodline actually follows the person who had the family who basically genealogically would have that bloodline, whether that's a woman or a man, by sex. So the word mepe would apply to both kinds of rulers. And so that's like a way that I've kind of borrowed a term from another language that I'm using within this book to kind of solve something that I don't necessarily like, or the kind of affect that using the word, for example, like takavod would have on my fantasy. So that's like one specific example of language and how I've come to solve that within Armenian.
That's so cool. And not where I thought that was going to go. And I was pretty sure that, so I have, an app for studying Armenian language,
Yeah.
and that's something that will trip me up. I also want to say it's like I'm baby steps here. That's something that'll trip me up is occasionally a gendered word.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm glad to know because I thought that was kind of new, and partially because you know, what I'm looking at on this app on my phone is not the language that was spoken in my home.
Right, right.
Which is, you know, 100 years old. And language changes quickly and often. Um, so that's really exciting that one, you're taking some I don't want to say ownership, although I'm glad you're taking ownership of language. Um, you're taking advantage of this opportunity, I guess, to leave a mark on the language. That's also really special.
Thanks, Sarah. I mean, I hope I do in a positive way, but I think part of it is being true to myself as a writer, and saying I'm going to use the words that I feel best fit what I'm trying to say, right? And so, and I'm really going to think about the words that I'm using because I know they impact first my story, but also they impact the way I tell my story, and then they impact the way my story is received. So, I might seem extreme, but it almost feels like an ethical question in a way, and staying true to myself as a writer, particularly because, you know, fantasy itself as a genre is it's very interesting when you think about the rise of fantasy with 19th century colonial imperialism. And you think about, you know, if you really think about, you know, the male authors that came out with fantasy in that period, you know, there is an ontology, there is an othering, right? And we could even trace this back to thinking about medieval romances. I mean, I really see 19th century European fantasy as an extension of the medieval European romance, right? You have an adventure that takes place outside of, let's say, the court, or outside of kind of the European, you know, social system. And all the adventures happen in the quote unquote East. You know, all the adventures kind of happen in these otherworldly places. And then, of course, the, you know, the hero then will return back to their original place as a way of going on this adventure. So the things that happen outside of that homosocial space, right, in the otherworldly spaces, are the place where adventure is allowed, right? So there's always a contrast between what is allowed and what could happen in European spaces, and then what could happen in the otherworldly spaces. So having said that, going back to your question, you know, I think it's important for me, and I'm being very intentional about not positioning this fantasy in a place that kind of leaps or takes a step from as a foundation European fantasy, though I'm not saying that that doesn't have its place, or I'm not knocking that down. But for me, traditionally, growing up also, and reading this fantasy and feeling kind of very disconnected from these group of authors, I want to create a space where, you know, Armenian kids that read fantasy can say, oh yeah, I relate to this culturally. You know, like what the basis for all this, from where it's coming. I've heard of that king, or I've heard of that name, or oh yeah, that sounds like very familiar. Like that sounds something like something I can connect to. And honestly, this belief was very much influenced by one of my favorite, probably all-time favorite fantasy writers, which is N.K. Jemisin. You probably know her Broken Earth trilogy. And in her masterclass on fantasy, you know, she talks about being young and going to the library and asking the librarian to kind of point out all these fantasy books. And, you know, she says, like, I feel like I couldn't really relate to a lot of these. And, you know, she says that she realized that to help change the profession, or to help change the genre, you have to be like, you know, you have to be present with your existence, right? And that really stuck with me, especially thinking about writing Armenian fantasy. Like, it really stuck with me to think, like, how could it's not even about me, but how could I make the existence of Armenians and Armenianness known, right, through this genre?
You know, I every time I hear stories like that, the story of, you know, someone intentionally putting themselves in the story, um, I get so emotional. It was something to, you know, I'm gonna just get real personal and pretend you're my therapist. I think I was interested as a child in fantasy because there's it seems like there's a trope in which someone who is somehow othered is experiencing something, right? And I want to talk about tropes a little bit and the hero's journey a little bit. Um, and I sort of held on to that, right? I was a lonely kid. And it wasn't until, and um, I'm not from this background. This story sort of surprised me how much it struck me. But I was watching the Marvel TV show Miss Marvel. At the end of the first episode, I was just bawling because that was me. That was me as a kid, and that was my family. I mean, I'm not Muslim, and I'm not in New York, but I that was the first time, and it was so healing for me. And also, the actress looks like me. If I, looked like an actress, if Hollywood would have me.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, it just she was just like me as a kid, and it was so powerful. And it was something that I've sort of like ignored, avoided talking about was my own feelings about representation. And so then, I had to face it, which was really, really special and really surprising, but probably only surprising because I had refused to engage with it. So when it's not about me anymore, um, the point of that was to celebrate folks who are doing that work, which that one is Fatima Asghar, I think, is a big part of writing that show. So, it's
Yeah.
gonna be cool. Uh, um, is so I know Western literature is obviously what I'm most familiar with because I am a Western person who speaks English, um, who only speaks English. And so the tropes I'm familiar with are from Western literature and the story paradigms and structures that I'm familiar with are from Western literature. So um with that in mind, do we see that in the work that you're doing? I want to say like I'm asking this question with what you said in mind about what young Armenians are reading in Armenian school being, age appropriate but outdated. Um, so are we putting things like the hero's journey into play in this Armenian fantasy?
Yeah, that's a great point. So I think it's interesting how a good story is a good story, and it doesn't matter, I think, what language you write in, because there's narrative structures that um fall into a hero's journey, and
Mhm.
obviously those tropes date back to ancient epic literature, right?
Yeah,
So
that is what I was thinking. I was pretty sure it
yeah,
was based on the Odyssey or something.
yeah, I mean, right, the Odyssey, Gilgamesh, Beowulf, and clearly, there's certain things that you might expect in fantasy, in traditional fantasy. You have the hero, you have the sidekick, you have the long journey, you have the people that are getting in the way of the journey. um I don't think that narrative structure is owned by culture. I think it's owned by writing. I think it's owned by the craft. um and so I don't think you're compromising by, you know what I mean, following kind of the markers of narrative structure when it
Oh,
comes to,
totally, totally.
yeah, yeah. And I didn't think that you were saying that by any means. I think it's though, I think maybe it's the way you, well, the language itself already, I think, forces a type of representation, right? And it's interesting because the story itself can be based on a narrative structure, but the language is what nuances that story. And the ability of what the language can give you in terms of describing or creating a world. But also I think it's the way in which how much what you say and how much you say and what's said and not said, right, becomes also part of that narrative structure. So in the first book of my fantasy, so it's called Mepe and the Dragon, we have two converging storylines, right? So we start with, Rupen and Melia, and it's the big day for Rupen because he's about to get inaugurated into the ceremony of fire. That's a traditional ceremony that happens within his, I call it mepe uchun, or we can say the English equivalent is like royal family, when you come of age. So it's kind of a coming of age story. And so they have a number of tasks they're supposed to achieve to get to this fire jumping ceremony, which obviously comes from Armenian tradition, to jump over fires. And so, but that converges with a secondary story that has to do with basically the mepe of one of these families, this mepe Ochuns, that is supposed to be present at the ceremony, but is not, because she's actually, they are told, is being held captive by a dragon in the north. And so part of the adventure is Rupen and Melian, his little brother Levon, who happens to, by the way, get like pulled by the leg by this mythical creature in Armenian Persian literature called the Arales, and ends up flying back with, this creature because they befriend each other. And so that, hence the journey starts of trying to figure out where this Mepe is, and where she's hidden, and with this dragon. So the tropes of my story, you could say, are very much grounded in epic tradition, and are very much grounded in, the genre of fantasy. But what I hope to be doing, and I hope I'm doing it, is that those tropes extend from a Armenian historiography and literary culture. They extend from kind of characters, mythical creatures, occurrences, cultural kind of artifacts that are Armenian, and in that sense provide a different kind of flavoring to this Armenian narrative, but also kind of complicate the way that we think about fantasy as a genre as well.
So when you engage with fantasy, and as a reader, right? I'm operating under the assumption that as writers, we are informed by reading.
Absolutely.
And I would be alarmed to hear someone disagree with me.
Right, of course.
But those people exist. Now you mentioned N.K. Jemisin, who I haven't read. I own the 5th season. It's very near me, but out of reach currently. Whose work do you go to, especially when you were younger and reading for fun, before you were sort of studying the work, right?
Yeah. Well, when I was younger, reading for fun, I definitely read mostly Arthurian romances, actually. So, and then The Life of Merlin. So I loved like Yvonne, The Knight of the Cart, anything I can get my hands on, medieval romances, Christian and Isolde, things like that. Then of course I was a huge fan of Lewis and Tolkien, and then I started looking into what young adult fantasy was now. And so some of my favorites for that age group, I like Palonini's The Inheritance Cycle, which is about Aragon, who finds like this dragon egg, and leads this whole cycle into like adventures about dragons and so on. I really like Ayanna Gray's Beasts of Prey. I don't know if you've heard of that, but so basically it takes place in this like Pan-African inspirational world, and then there's these two characters that venture into this magical jungle, and they start kind of having all these adventures there, and they start hunting monsters there. Um, there's, I mean, as a kid wanting to be like a knightess myself, I really liked Tamara Pierce's fantasy series, The Story of the Lioness, because it's about Alana, who's trying to be basically a knightess. So it's about her journey. So instead of the main character being, a boy as a squire like Arthur, or something like that. I really liked Rachel Hartman's Serafina, because it's like a kind of a murder mystery thing set in a kingdom of, I think it's Gorid, and she's 16 years old, but she has this like magical flute and she's a total musician. But then there's a murder in the castle, so there's like these adventures that need to be solved. Um, That's more for the young adult I've been reading. And if others actually have recommendations, I would love to hear it. And recently I got into the Chinese fantasy series, which was called translated as The Three Body Problem, which was also very fascinating that I think they're making a Netflix series about it. And in terms of TV shows, I just finished watching something called Cursed, where it's about Excalibur, but there's a fairy queen descendant who actually owns Excalibur. And I won't give it away in case you want to watch it, but there's some intermingling with the magical worlds of the Arthurian, legends. But Arthur is kind of like this thief who actually doesn't have Excalibur but steals it at one point, and so it's a very interesting take on the Arthurian legends. And oh yeah, I did watch the Arthdale Chronicles, which is a Korean fantasy series that was actually phenomenal. That I would recommend. And I'm sure I forgot a bunch of them.
Oh, of course.
Of course.
Of course. There's no way around it.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. I love thinking about sort of the stories that raised us, and who we've become as a result. And especially like I think it's interesting where we deviate and where we return as writers.
Yeah.
People.
Yeah.
So with last time we spoke, you said there was an amount of sort of rebelling from what you were supposed to be engaging with at school and then coming back to it. If I'm misremembering, please correct me. And then coming back to it because it is important. Did the same thing happen with fantasy at all, or was fantasy sort of part of your rebellion, especially given that it's of a specific culture?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. So yeah, I was always obsessed with fantasy, the medieval world, and all that stuff. And I remember, I mentioned last time feeling very disconnected to a lot of the things I was writing. I love what you just said. You said that the stories that raise us. And, I think what I'm thinking a lot about in this book is the oral tales that raised me. So not necessarily what I got to read, but the stories that were told to me by my grandparents, by my parents. I think that's very influential in the way you think about narrative, like not only as a writer, but as like a person thinking about the narrative of your life, right? Because you're like, these are the narratives that kind of dominated my family. And I not separate from that because that's my nostalgia. And so when you think about how you build narrative, if you do as a writer build narrative on nostalgia, you almost can't escape the oral tales that were told to you of your parents and their grandparents, and obviously having grandparents that were genocide survivors, thinking also about how that orality is traumatic, while simultaneously also thinking that it can only be traced to a certain extent, right? So I think that really does inform the way I think about narrative, but not as a way of kind of becoming uncreative with it or becoming like a clutch, or like like stopping me from it, but the importance of what is said and what is told and what is not told, right? And the silences kind of, and the impact of that silence in the way not only that you tell a story, but the details that you provide in a particular story. So I think, I mentioned this also last time that I used to write in English and I used to dabble in Armenian. I realized that Armenian was just better for me to the better language to write in for me as a creative person. So I started actually a fantasy series like 10 years ago, and I felt like it was horrible. Like I just felt like it really wasn't doing what I wanted it to do for me. I really felt like the narrative was lacking. And, I said, I think I'm just going to have to write this in Armenian. And that was just changing the language. So, in a way, am I rebelling it? I mean, I guess maybe I am, but also it's like you said, we always kind of return to our loves, like, and We always kind of return to where our heart sits. And um, whatever happens with this book, I know I have to write it because I know that my heart sits there. And what if I deny it now, it's just gonna come back. Because I realized a long time ago that it's something that needs to be completed. It's something that I need closure with in myself. So
This is not relevant. Do you write in do you write in the Armenian alphabet or do you write in the Roman alphabet?
no, I write in Armenian. You mean do I write in the Roman alphabet and then turn the letters into Armenian letters, or do I write just directly in Armenian?
Yeah, I was thinking like transliteration.
Oh no, I just write directly in Armenian. Yeah. And okay, I'm glad you brought that up because there's some language stuff I'm dabbling with in this book. And there's this like series of books that I had that talk about Proto-Armenian or Armenian before the alphabet, hieroglyphics and stuff. So I'm actually relying on some of that language as part of the narrative. So there are different languages that are spoken between the different Mepeuchuns, like the different families. And I'm going back to like there's engravings that come from this period. And so I'm really having fun with language here because I'm getting to explore a lot of the, pre-written, like that pre-alphabet kind of Armenian symbols. So it's been really fun to do that and to like dabble with that.
It's really cool. Uh okay, so um here's you mentioned the old stories and I mentioned folklore. Um and then you started talking a little bit about your plot for book one.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of, I know very few myths. I know very few folk tales. And it still managed to remind me of them.
Good.
How do I say this? Inspired by, or perhaps playing with any particular stories. Like those are two different things, right? Like I'm taking a story and I'm basing it off that versus I'm inspired by all the stories that I've been told.
My honest answer is I don't think so. But I know subconsciously it's there somewhere, and I'm sure other people will tell me. And that's going to be the great part of all of this because, when you write something and people are like, was this based on da 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 da? And you're like, cool, I never thought of that, but it's sitting there. I know that story, it's sitting there. But it's just lovely how when other people get to make connections, I feel like when other people take your work and they connect it to something that means something to them or has some kind of like, something like that fills them or makes them happy, or then I feel like you've done something as a writer because, you're able to get people to connect in ways you never imagined to your story.
That makes me so happy. I was trying to think, and I've got a couple of books across the room. They're absolutely falling apart, which is very sad. They're old books of folk tales, and I don't remember them at all. And they're, small books with big pictures. Um, but there was something you said, and it reminded me of a story, and the way that my dad titled it or whatever when he would tell it to us was the devil with the three golden hairs. And in my head, I always said dragon. And so that's what happened for me. But it got me excited. And I think that that's maybe there'll be a question in this. I think that's what's maybe most exciting about fantasy. And I would love your take, I guess, whether or not I ask a question, is that it allows us to shrug off the expectations that we deal with every day and indulge in something else, maybe better, maybe different, maybe exciting. But we get to shrug off what holds us down in real life.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's actually a permittable space to do that, right? I mean, again, just going because I'm a medievalist, I'm just gonna go back to medieval romance. The creation of the fantasy world or the other world or the adventurous world that, the European knights like Lancelot and Gawain go into. they're permittable worlds, right? Because they come with a quest. And I think it's very interesting in those narratives that the quest has to be justified, right? I mean, the entering of the other world has to be justified through a quest, right? It's like a moral, ethical thing that they're doing for their king, for their people. But I think, you know, fantasy now as a genre itself becomes a permittable space to do exactly as you described. Um, and I think that's really cool too.
I've
Absolutely.
never heard that term before, permittable space. I feel like it's clear what it means from context. I need permission to enter this new space
Yeah, right.
via quest, perhaps. Um, is that something that is that term something that shows up a lot when you study these things?
I
Oh,
just myself.
I was excited. But I think that's important too, right?
I know,
We don't have permission to not be buttoned up outside of the art we indulge in. And maybe that's TV and maybe that's music, whatever it is. Um, but that is where we have permission to stop or
yeah,
start.
yeah. I mean, I think no, I think it's interesting because I think is it the genre that gives you permission to, or is it yourself that gives you permission? I mean, there's so many like kind of it's a prism, right? This question that you ask, and I don't know the answer. But I know that as a kid, that was a space that it was a place to escape, right? And it was a place that your imagination could run freely. And then it was also a place where you're like, okay, this is definitely someplace else. Like for me, you know, because there are many ways that I don't really connect to this space. It's cool, but I know it's not my space, you know. And I'm just maybe, you know, a part of me believes that that inner child in me that loved fantasy at a very young age is coming out more and more in this book, and I'm allowing her to in many ways as a writer. And I think I thought about that a lot. Like, how often do we let our inner child speak when we're writing as writers? And is it permittable because I'm writing fantasy, right? Or when do we allow that voice to come out? And you know, I think the best one of the best things about writing this is allowing her to come out and like asking her like, well, what would you think is cool in this book? You know what I mean? Because there's the adult me that thinks that fantasy is XYZ. But then there's, you know, the young person that's like, yeah, this is the book that I would want to read when I was 13 that didn't exist, you know?
Something I'm hearing a lot, and it's got to just be synchronicity, but um, I've been hearing that a lot lately in these conversations where there's some healing, there's some piece of the writer's youth that is doing some work
Mhm.
or doing some healing as we make art. Which is pretty cool that that keeps coming up. Uh,
Yeah.
um,
I mean, I think it's natural that it would because I think writing is really self-exploration ultimately, right? Um, and it's also where we find the things that stop us, the things that halt us, and the things that hold our tongue, or you know, the voices and the audience that we think we're writing for. I think I feel very grateful because my imagined audience is very kind, it's very excited, you know, it's very eager, it's very supportive. And I've been in book projects where I have imagined that audience to be very critical, male oriented, unsupportive. And that has really changed the whole process of writing. So, you know, that's something I always try to remind myself of. Like the people that I'm writing this for, I want to imagine as, you know, people that support me and my work and are excited for what I have to say. And I think that's part of the challenges also of writing something like this is staying present in that kind of space because, you know, obviously as writers, we think most of the time that our work is complete shit, right? And so we're always having to face that voice, that critical voice in us. As we get further and further along in the story, and we've read it so many times, it becomes uninteresting, right? But it's new to other people, and they're going to receive it in a new way. And it's important, I think, and it's not easy. I obviously don't think it's easy at all, but I try to remind myself that, what I'm creating is going to be new for someone else. It's going to be something, I mean, a friend of mine said that once and it really stuck with me, that it's going to be new for someone else, and that um I am not the last person to read it. You know what I mean? And that other people should decide how they feel about it. And that was some great advice I got from a friend.
I
So,
was writing that down. I've been taking notes the whole time. We've talked about this a little bit as a result of just the conversation in general, but I feel I would be remiss if I didn't directly ask, what's special about fantasy?
hmm.
I mean, for you, you can speak as objectively as you want to, but I'm asking about you.
I think it's special when you're allowed to create like a whole entire world that exists in a whole entire place with all these different characters. So okay, here's the little girl answer. Like, who wouldn't want to create a world where you get to dictate things that happen?
I don't think that answer has an age. I
Yeah,
think I think that's what's really special about, I don't know, calling yourself an artist, being an artist, is that we don't have to pretend that it's not still
right,
true.
right. And I mean, and then you get to create and dictate the story of this world, and you get to have the good people win. And, especially if in life you felt like that hasn't always happened, you know, you have a control over kind of celebrating qualities and characteristics of characters and people that you find value in, right? And um, having a place to say something that you think is important. And then I guess I'll say maybe this doesn't have an age either, but kind of the literary critic, adult writer, author in me is like, this is a place that I can shape things. This is a place where I can help young Armenian readers find excitement in literature. This is a place where I could maneuver um, like cultural messages that are important and allow readers of a young age to feel connected to being Armenian and not feel so isolated from the literary world and from the genre, which is feels like a huge responsibility. I mean, it is. I mean, I'm both psyched and scared, obviously, at the same time at that responsibility. Um, but I'm up for the challenge, and I feel like like N.K. Jemisin said, fight the battle, like, so I feel like I'm gonna fight the battle and I'm gonna do it. And even if it's discussed, even if it's like, criticized, even if it's like, this is great, this is it, that we're still having a conversation about fantasy literature in Armenian, right? So it's better than not having it at all.
Matters.
Yeah, it matters.
Yeah, lost it. I didn't write down my question that time. Um, oh shoot, it was something good, man. You said something really beautiful.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Okay. So I was thinking about, finding something of yourself and therefore finding some excitement in literature is something that's difficult for a lot of kids because of the pressure put on them, right? And adults too, surely. The pressure put on them to read and the pressure to enjoy reading, and something that I have found a lot of the time when I work with folks who struggle to read. And in my experience, it's almost always been young people, but that's not a universal, has been, it doesn't, the mistake we make a lot of the time is looking at people's reading level rather than interests. And it doesn't matter if we struggle to identify what the words are and what the sounds are. If we're excited, we're going to do it. And that with your work has the dual purpose, or not purpose, that has the dual result of both getting me excited about my culture and getting me excited about reading and even language in general.
Mhm.
And that's a big deal.
Thank
I
you,
mean,
sir.
reading and literacy used to only belong, not reading, but literacy used to only belong to the elite. Um, because those are the folks who could afford education outside of utility. And as such, having that ability, which I'm going to say you're not going to have if you're not excited about it, opens so much of life. So
Yeah, yeah,
interesting.
and I think, this isn't just for young adults. Like it could be a particular level of reader of Armenian that could pick this book up and read it. And I think for me, I'm trying to make the story accessible and interesting to hopefully anyone that wants to read it, not just, for example, this particular, age level or school grade. Um, but I mean, I think it's also, since you brought it back to language, it's also important to acknowledge that what does it mean to write fantasy in an endangered language? I mean, to me, there's something very symbolic there. And what the symbolism that I see is, the ability for this language, first pragmatically to be able to sustain itself through a readership of Armenian, because we already know most people, the decline in like people reading is much less, but imagine, people reading an endangered language is much, much, much less. But also it's like the fantasy space and writing fantasy in a language, it almost like is a rejuvenation of the language. One, in that we have to create a vocabulary and almost reinvent or bring back a vocabulary around this kind of genre of epic myth, etc. But also it's like I feel like kind of like flickering lights that are saying like we're staying alive, we're sustaining ourselves, we don't have to, we can still dabble in this language and we could still play in this language. And I think those are really important areas that oftentimes, become threatened when a language is endangered because there's this fear of losing it. So there's this movement toward like a perfectionism of it or a way to use it. Like I need to dictate to you how to use the language in order to keep its survival. And, writing fantasy in it, I think is exactly an area that allows for that language to evolve as a language and very much becomes a reflection of the hope. I mean, I'm gonna say hope, but I mean, for it, I'm gonna say it as actually as an indicative sentence for its sustainability long term, right? For its future.
I think that's a really cool, like I didn't really think of it that way, and it's absolutely true that when we're trying to preserve something, we're trying to preserve it in um mm, like a time capsule, right? And so it's frozen, but you're right. It has to be alive to survive. Um oh, that's cool. That's exciting. That's gonna stick with me. Thank you.
Yeah.
Um We're low on time, but if you don't mind, I still have a couple questions I'd love to ask. If you're out of time, we can talk again.
Yeah.
So going back to just writing fantasy, and I'm gonna let the YA slide for a while. You said this already, and this is something I say all the time. A good story is a good story. The way that we market things based on the age of the narrator is sort of beside the point. Um, I mean, we want the audience we want, but it's sort of beside the point of creating story. So is there any way, because you seem so very conscious of your work, and I'm so not. Like I know I know what I'm working on, but I can't tell you where it's going to go at all. Is there some structure that you need in place, like you personally? I'm not going to ask you to speak for everyone. Um, when or before you're writing something in a totally different world? I mean, like world building or an understanding or like scaffolding. I don't know. I have no idea.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would love to talk about some of the actual like writing process of writing fantasy or just writing in general. So I had this pitch, I gave it almost a year ago. And so here I am, I'm supposed to produce this work, right? And so when I gave the pitch, I had about like 45, 50 pages of the story written. And believe it or not, I totally tossed the whole thing out. So I've had this practice for
So
years.
much work.
Yeah.
It
I
sounds like it's not
uh,
because you see a novel and it's like 300 pages, but we're
no,
talking about on a computer. We're talking
yeah.
about 8.5 by 11.
Yep. And honestly, it was based on some feedback, especially from my brilliant son, who I believe gave me some amazing advice. And some of it was that, fantasy has moved away from these long narrative expositions of the romantic kind of 19th, 20th century writers, where you describe these long, landscapes. And
Good way for
thinking
me to
about it, yeah, I think, and me as a medievalist, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna go on these long, descriptions. And it's like, no, action-based fantasy is a thing. It helps readers stay motivated. Well, anyway, so I had this
I'll take
practice.
it. I'll take the long descriptions once I'm in,
Right,
but I
but
need to
not
I
where you
need to
start.
be
Yeah.
invested first. And that's I have long thought that that was a personal flaw. So I'm really glad to hear somebody else say it.
No, I think it's a really good writing strategy, because it's like I have to, and you want to be invested, and then you're like, oh wow, this is interesting because now I want to think about it. But I had started this practice a long time ago in my life, and so I wake up pretty early in the morning, and I had been told by a Mayan priestess that my sign is Akbal, which is the moment where light meets darkness, and that's my most creative time of day. And so I generally love to write with the sunrise, and it is, I feel, my most creative time of day. And so I started this practice many years ago. And so I wake up and I write first, and it's the first thing I do. And on a good day, I could write 3, 4 hours. On a a day that's kind of packed, I'll write like half an hour, but at minimum is half an hour. And so I decided I had to toss that stuff out, or at least, you copy paste it into your document thinking that, you have it there to rely on it. We all do that. And, and I started with staring at the blank page and looking outside for a couple, maybe a week of sessions in my writing at the beginning of the fantasy. And then I decided, nope, I'm going to draw. And I cannot draw at all. And so I started just doodling and drawing and thinking about landscapes, thinking about characters. And it kind of evolved, not, and then I turned to the page, and I came up with the first scene. So then I evolved the first scene. So it's been kind of like an adventure of like mixed artistic kind of endeavors, most of which maybe I'm not good at all. But giving myself the grace to dabble in different forms of art as a way of thinking about the imagined world, basically. Um, and I kind of feel like I got through it, and now this is my favorite part to be at as a writer, is when you have enough stamina that the story is now writing itself. um yeah.
That's beautiful. I feel like I am not at all an idea guy.
Yeah.
Um, like occasionally I'll hear like a phrase and I'll be like, that's a story. More often I hear a phrase and I think that's a story for you. Uh, but more often I feel like I've got a person or I've got a character maybe, or just a vibe, and that's the thing that's driving me, which is why I mentioned your consciousness over your story. And I do think, and I say this a lot to other writers who I work with, that you're the god of this story. Like these decisions are yours. That's like in a workshop setting. I don't want anyone to think like
Yeah.
my thoughts matter. I mean, maybe my thoughts do matter, but they shouldn't dictate you. Um, Rewinding. So of course, I'm in control in most ways of what goes on the paper. I write on paper. Um, but I very much feel like there's not a lot of consciousness deciding these things. So I'm really grateful to hear you talk about that in terms I can understand.
Yeah, I mean, Sarah, I also think there's a consciousness, but over consciousness is also going to, I think, you know, not allow the creativity to come out as much. So I'm also mindful of not being so intentionally or like purpose driven. You know what I mean? Like as if I have an agenda of what I'm trying to create. And so I know where I'm going, but I also want to allow that flow to come in creatively, and not kind of be boggled down by like, okay, these are the main points I'm trying to get through. You know what I mean in the
Hmm.
story. Um, but
That's for
one
later.
yeah, but one book I will highly recommend, and I can't take credit for it because my son Rafi, who's a very, very talented writer and aspiring filmmaker, recommended Robert McGee's Story. And he really talks about the principles and structures of narrative in screenwriting. And you
It's
know how
just called story.
yeah, it's called Story, by Robert McGee. And that really helped me think about narrative. And it was really interesting to turn to screenwriting as like a platform or a way of
Hmm.
organizing ideas. But to think about like the hero's journey that McGee kind of really talks about and narrative structure, that was one thing I read early on that was very influential in thinking about how I wanted to structure the fantasy, particularly when I realized that I wanted it to be action driven initially. So yeah.
I know you said you scrapped a lot of the story and that you're a describer. Did that was that hard to start with action?
Um, Once I figured out what kind of action I wanted to start with, no. But at first, that initial incident, which I think is a screenwriting term, but don't quote me on it. Where it basically leads or it ignites the action of the story. That was really hard to come up with. It was really challenging to say like what kind of action is gonna start the story. I actually started watching like really interesting, you know, like detective films or mysteries. Think about how they organized the narrative there. That was a little helpful. Went back and read some Agatha Christie. Um, I watched superhero films to think about how they, you know what I mean? Like they
Well, it's the
created,
same thing, right?
right? Absolutely,
We just
absolutely.
classify it differently in our,
Right.
strange method of classifications.
Yeah, like how did this hero's journey start? Comics. I'm a huge fan of Neil Gaiman, so I went and looked at some of Gaiman's work. I like the sound, you know, which is very, very fascinating. I don't know. I started reading around things too, things around,
I
not necessarily,
definitely read to study,
yeah.
which
Right.
I'm always sort of going back and forth about if that's, I want to read to enjoy it, but the more I enjoy it, the more I start to look critically at it.
Mhm.
And I don't know where the line is. That's, you know, the
Yeah.
life of an artist.
Right.
Um, I think that's all of we got sort of beyond my fantasy knowledge very quickly. And my important questions were, um, why? I think that's a question I will always ask, no matter who I'm talking to. It's, why this thing? And your answers have so much depth, which is really exciting. Um, I'm actually thinking, and maybe I should just say this when we're off air. We have this wonderful a friend of the Writing Center, a longtime board member, who's also a medievalist. She studies the Mad Woman.
Mhm,
I'd love to see you two talk. Maybe I can make a panel or something.
mhm.
Do you have anything you want to add about fantasy, about preservation, about your work? You have so many really cool projects. I think actually, if you'll let me talk about the book you have coming out in the spring
Yeah,
another
sure.
time. I mean, we talked about it a little bit on the phone once, and I've been telling everyone who will listen to me about it. A lot of people don't know what I'm talking about.
I do want to say one thing about fantasy, and that you don't have to know or study fantasy to write fantasy. Like, I don't want to give the impression that if someone is interested in writing fantasy, that oh well, you have to reach a certain like kind of degree or meter, or I think you should write whatever you feel like writing. And maybe even don't study it, because then it becomes so formulaic that you're almost kind of inhibited by the genre itself and its history. But I do want to say, I think We could also say, genre, does it exist? I mean, are we not just recreating genre as we're writing? And isn't every book its own kind of genre? You know what I mean? In and of itself. So,
I made a poet from this area. I think she's actually president of our board right now. I made her come on this show and argue with me about whether or not genre exists. I am of the belief it does not. She was very kind because I told her my intentions straight out were to debate this together.
that's great.
She's a poet, right? And I am a prose writer who thinks that all sentences are lyric. Um, so it was very kind of her, and I'm very happy to hear you say it. With that in mind, actually, I assume that we will often write the things we enjoy, right? Um, so you're giving permission there to folks to write beyond what they know if it excites them. I just
Yeah.
want to highlight that. That's really beautiful, especially as someone who I feel like I have very poor suspension of disbelief. I know I once had an imagination. I don't know where it went. It seems to only be interested in like, circling three topics over and over and over again. Um, but I think that that's really important. Giving that permission to others, to yourself, to write what excites you, whether or not you have familiarity. We gotta write what comes.
Mhm.
Did I interrupt you? Was there more?
No, I just wanted to make it clear that I wasn't suggesting that you had to be an expert of fantasy to write fantasy.
That did not come across. Thank you for clarifying. Then thank you for being here. My next step is to give updates on the Writing Center and then a prompt. So I hope you'll hang out with me while I give those.
Yeah, I mean, Sarah, it's always a pleasure to be on the show, and thank you so much for whoever tuned in or will watch later.
Oh, I
Uh,
haven't even been keeping up. I hope we don't have like tons of questions.
oh, are
I'm
there
not
questions?
even on Facebook anymore. Never mind. Sorry,
Um,
friends, if you're watching.
yeah, I'm happy also to, get in touch with me if you're interested in talking more about writing. I'm really happy to make myself available to anyone that might be interested in having more of a conversation or, discussing their writing or anything like that. So it's really always such a pleasure, and thank you so much for having me and talking.
Oh, thank you. I hope that I've gotten you to. Oh, we do have some beautiful comments. Um, Thank you, Tavine, for complimenting our interview. Uh, but no questions, it looks like. Um, yeah, thank you so much for being here. I will try to hold you to coming back. And I'll just move into our updates. So we're in the giving season, and the Midwest Writing Center would like you to please consider us for your year-end giving donations. Money given to the Writing Center goes directly to working artists. I'm not talking about me, I'm talking about the artists we work with, such as Tamar, such as our wonderful workshop leaders, the faculty and staff of our annual conference, and our young interns. It goes to the authors that we publish, and money spent locally stays local. So please consider that. All the information on donating is on our website at mwcqc.org. Um, our first our first event in the new year will be a workshop, a class on Zoom with Iowa Writers Workshop alum Logan Hoffman Smith. They will be teaching on vertical moments in fiction. Information on that will be on our website this week. It is not yet there, so if you have any questions, feel free to send me a PM or email me. Information will be in the on how to contact me will be in the comments or the description of the video on YouTube. Of course, a private message is a private message. I'm the person who will answer it, so any questions can go there. We are still accepting submissions to the Radical Hospitality Project until December 15th. We're looking for writing that engages with the topic of radical hospitality, whatever that means to you. We're talking about welcoming the stranger. We're talking about treating others as we would like to be treated ourselves, especially in our most vulnerable moments. Selected works will receive $100 and print publication, and then further opportunities for podcast recording, performances, and more money. We are also still accepting submissions to the Foster Stall chapbook series that's open to anyone in the Midwest of chapbook length work. Chapbooks are super short books. We are not genre specific here, so it can be poetry, it can be prose, it can be hybrid. We are not currently able to accept illustrations or translations. Chapbooks are also traditionally, they have a theme or a topic that they deal with specifically. Submissions for the Foster Stall chapbook series are open until 11:59 p.m. on December 31st. So good way to spend the new year. Winners of that chapbook series, or I guess selections of the chapbook series, will of course receive author copies and some payment, and they'll headline an event, and we'll be super excited about having you on our press. I think that's really all I've got for you, friends. I hope that you have a lovely day, a lovely week, whatever it is, until I see you again. And for today's prompt, I want you to put 5 minutes on your favorite timer or more if you have more. And I want you to imagine something outside of this reality. Thank you so much for hanging out with us today. And as always, please write more light into your life.